But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In today's episode, Paul and Ritchie discuss the Roman Emperor Commodus, successor and son of Marcus Aurelius, Rome's last good emperor. However, unlike his father, Commodus was not as wise or just ruler. Instead, he was known for his extravagant and erratic behavior, which quickly led to the decline of the Roman Empire. During his reign, Commodus became increasingly obsessed with his own power and grandeur. He saw himself as a godlike figure that was cruel and capricious, demanding to be worshipped, indulging in lavish spending, and executing any and all who he saw as a threat. Under Commodus' leadership, the Roman Empire suffered greatly. The economy faltered, crime rates soared, and the military suffered significant losses, triggering the end for the once great empire. Join us as we discuss Commodus, his leadership, the empire he inherited, and the beginning of its downfall. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the History in Motion podcast. Today we are going to be talking about Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus. So if you haven't listened to our previous episode, I'd recommend you listen to that first, because we talk in depth about who Marcus Aurelius was, how he rose to power, all the great things that he accomplished in his life, including his famous work known as Meditations, which is still one of the literary classics of today. And then his decision to pick Commodus, his natural-born son, as his successor, and the disaster that Commodus was. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely go give that a listen. That will kind of set the stage for our conversation today. So when we look at Marcus Aurelius and Commodus and why historians care so much about this decision, was the end of Marcus' death was 200 years of what we call the Pax Romana, which was 200 years of peace and prosperity within the Roman Empire. When Commodus took over, and especially around the time of his death, the empire has started this decline. And it's pretty harsh from the start of Commodus all the way down to the end of the empire itself. It's the western half. There are, some peaks and valleys where some better emperors come in, get things back on track. Then another terrible emperor takes over and accelerates that. But definitely, I think Commodus is a great accelerator of this decline, and really moves Rome into I guess that slow and steady decline is the best way to put it. So I think, Richie, we're going to kind of maybe start off with just giving a little bit of a bio of before Commodus became emperor. And then we will get into the craziness of him being an emperor. And I kind of teased last show that there are some incredible stories that we're going to get to today. So definitely stay tuned for some things that we would say are too crazy even for Hollywood to put into movies. So so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point for this particular episode, because it is a bit unique in terms of our approach, right? We are kind of dovetailing it and directly connecting it with the last episode, just because it's such a unique kind of turning point in this period of history. You have Marcus Aurelius, who kind of represents this very successful period of the Roman Empire, immediately followed by his son kind of being associated with the initiating point or the trigger point for the downfall or the initiation of the decline of the Roman Empire. So I think you don't always see that in history. So it's interesting to see that now. So Commodus was born in 161 AD. He lived until 192 AD. Like we said, he was a Roman emperor who ruled from 180 to 190 AD. And he was born in, not going to say this very well, Lanuvium near Rome, Italy, as the son of the famous Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So it was kind of hard to find any real details about his, his childhood. It doesn't seem to be very well documented. But I think just based on kind of historical norms and traditions that we've kind of discussed about already in this particular period of time, there's a lot of inference that we can kind of do here. And I think it's probably pretty safe historically to assume that most of these are more or less correct. But like similar to his father, being born in a family of significant status, obviously you're the son of an emperor. You're going to have resources and opportunities that kind of just come along with that. So Commodus received a very privileged education as the son of a Roman emperor. He was tutored by some of the most distinguished scholars and teachers of his time, including the philosopher and writer Herodes Atticus, the historian Cassius Dio, and the rhetorician Marcus Cornelius Fronto. So he was also trained in various other subjects of study. So this included philosophy, rhetoric, Roman law, so kind of those classical, traditional subjects that you kind of associate with elite studies at this time. He was also educated in military tactics and strategy, as he was expected to become a military leader and the commander-in-chief of the Roman armies. However, and this is the however that I think everyone's kind of expecting if you tuned in. Despite his very privileged upbringing and education and wealth of resources, he was known for his lack of interest in intellectual pursuits. He did, however, love physical activity, especially gladiatorial games, which we'll see play a pretty major role in kind of the crazy stories around his life, and other sports. He preferred to spend his time hunting, wrestling, engaging in other physical activities rather than focusing on his studies. Kind of allowing us to surmise a little bit, like unlike his father, who was obviously a very deep thinker, who was very invested and took time for intellectual pursuits. His son was more obsessed with physical activity, and some historians say that kind of lack of intellectual pursuits is what kind of led to his inability to make critical decisions and lead strategically or think strategically when he was, eventually the emperor.
I think too, we have to remember, he is young. He's a boy. This is, he's a boy. You can talk to most young boys and teenagers on what they want to do, and studying is probably pretty low on that list. Sure. But most young boys aren't going to be co-emperor at 16 and sole emperor at 19. So I guess the stakes are a bit different. One thing with him too is he did follow Marcus around for most of his life. He was on the northern frontier, living in military camps, probably being part of the military tradition of, getting up, going for runs, staying in physical shape. And so you can probably see that being in that environment maybe was part of what he liked on the physical side of things. Sure. But again, living in a frozen tent probably wasn't the best thing in the world. And there's something to that we see with Commodus, and he was kind of almost like a little bit of a mascot for the troops when he was younger. He's this little kid kind of running around the camps, and I think the soldiers really took a liking to him just based on, you're out here with a bunch of guys fighting a bunch of guys and dying of disease and cold and these terrible battles, and kind of brings a little bit of a smile to your face to see a little kid running around and just enjoying life in a much more simple way than, with all the terrible things going on. So you can definitely see he starts to get a liking by the troops at a pretty young age, and we'll see that that's important for him as time goes on.
Yeah, it's interesting to say, I think, that particular perspective. So when I was doing some research on him, so he was the youngest of their children between Faustina and Marcus. And, he was initially treated to being kind of the heir to the throne, but his father's death while on military campaign in 180 AD kind of forced him into that early succession plan for him to become emperor. So, and I can think you could see, probably a bit of conjecture here, but, the likelihood of what's going to happen when you put such a young person into such a position of power.
Yeah, and especially at that age too, and like, I always think too, I think he was born a twin, and his other twin died when he was like 4 or 5 years old, something like that. So maybe this was a good and evil twin sort of situation going on, and the evil one survived. But you're right. I think everything does come to him quite young, with the time of being ancient times, where kind of talked about a last episode where healthcare is not really, it's around, but it's not keeping people alive. Kids making it to adulthood is, quite rare, maybe 50-50 chance for a lot of these kids. Sure. And he's got this life kind of coming to him. People are dying all around him from the plague at the time, and I think we believe it's what gets Marcus in the end too, is this smallpox-like plague that's going through. And so, yeah, I think he's penned to be that leader. Marcus chooses him to basically keep some stability because, again, he doesn't know when he's going to die. And we don't even know Commodus could have picked up the plague too and died at a young age, and nobody really knows. So there's a lot of just, touch and go. And I think there's something in Meditations where Marcus says something like, make sure you take value and almost like kiss your kids goodnight every night because you don't know if they're going to be alive in the morning. Which it sounds pretty morbid today, but when you think back then, right, that was a legitimate thing. And Marcus had seen it where he would go to bed one night and he'd wake up and one of his children would be dead. So this is something I think that, there's death all around Marcus. He ends up choosing Commodus. Commodus takes over and at the age of 16 as co-emperors with Marcus to really establish that rule. And then Commodus takes over at the age of 19, which is still very young, and to be, sole emperor. So I think maybe we can get into a little bit of what happens immediately after Marcus's death and just how from a pretty early on stage, we can see that this man is not like his father in the slightest. And to the point where rumors were flying around that his mother had an affair with a gladiator, and that's who Commodus actually was. And he wasn't actually the son of Marcus. So like I said, Commodus takes over at 19. From the get-go, many scholars see him as a self-absorbed boy who loved sport, possibly a sociopath, and somebody with nobody to keep him in check. But the people mostly loved him. The army also loved him too for most of his reign. And it wasn't really until the end where people outside of his inner circle and in the Senate, people like that were in power, didn't really see him as a terrible leader. And we'll get into how he was able to keep the masses and the army so happy. So the first thing he did to keep the army happy is Marcus dies. Commodus immediately abandons the campaigns in Germany, where his father had made so much progress. We don't know for sure if this was a good decision or a bad decision. Marcus may have said, hey, look, we're ready to wrap up. You can probably head back, because maybe Marcus was too sick to travel. And then once he died, he's like, let's go back. But then again, there's some people argue that there was probably a few years left that he could have done to really solidify things, but he didn't want to go back. So he signed peace treaties with the German tribes, marched back to Rome. So what kind of we see here is why the army is going to be happy is you're a soldier, you're fighting in the frozen frontier, and you are told you can go home to see your family and go back to your land. That's going to make any soldier happy.
Of course.
And then part of it is, did he go back because he thought the work was done, or did he just want to go back to Rome and do his gladiatorial things? We don't know for sure, but I think we can make some assumptions based on that. So when he returned to Rome, he gave every citizen a gift of free money and through many, many games. So games being horse races, gladiatorial battles. And I think that's interesting about games in Rome was games were used as a way of kind of population control, public order, keeping the people happy. So all citizens were able to go into the Colosseum for free. They could go to horse races for free, and the state would fit the bill for all of that. So when Commodus just kept throwing games, the people were really happy. It's like, this guy's spending all this money on us. But then again, that's
interesting, right? Because the thing that came to mind while we were talking about this, he wasn't this kind of hated or loathed ruler from the get-go. He actually seemed to have, some popularity amongst the population and the armies initially. And, this kind of interplay of him seeing himself as this kind of gladiatorial gamesman kind of figure is very interesting, and how it kind of plays in to the broader psyche of the population that he's governing over. He obviously seems to understand at some level that this is what the people want to some degree.
Definitely. It's what he wants. It's what the people want.
Yeah.
But the guy who's running the treasury is going to start looking at him really soon and saying,
hey, buddy,
we can't keep this up. Right. And I think it's the classic emperor sort of strategy of give the people what they want, give the army what they want. And what do they want? Games and money, food. Yep. Give them all that. They're going to love you. Right. But
keep them fed and entertained. Right. I think that was
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Basic stuff. So to be able to start paying for a lot of this stuff, though, this is just interesting about how we look at where we are, today in the early 2023. So Commodus started devaluing the Roman currency. So basically the coins would have gold and silver in them. And so this is a common practice amongst emperors, and it gets worse and worse as time goes on, is they start to take a little bit of silver or gold out of the coin and replace it with a cheaper metal. So they can print, essentially, not print, but develop more coins, so they can pay for these things. But even back then, inflation is very much a real thing.
Sure.
And so, I have a quote written down here, that we would say is, even the Romans knew you couldn't just print more money. Like there's a point where the value gets so low, right? And so inflation explodes. The empire's now in economic struggles based on Commodus continuing to devalue his currency. It was the most, I think, that it was ever done since Nero, and Nero had kind of the same sort of mindset as well. So that's kind of how he's able to get through, giving the army money, giving the citizens money, throwing all of these games. And, people are starting to question, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But Commodus really has little interest in business of administration, and tended throughout his reign to leave the practical running of the state to a succession of favorites, beginning with Sertorius, a male lover, who was a freedman from Nicomedia, which is, I believe, out near kind of Turkey area. So again, a freedman is a former slave who's now free. So again, that's a big, like, people looking down, like, why is the emperor taking a former slave as his male lover? And then, just whoever's close to him, whoever he can trust, whoever his buddies are at the time, he's putting into power. So merit is kind of going out the window. And so Sertorius realizes that, okay, we're devaluing the currency a lot, and I don't have enough money to pay for these games. So how can we get more money? Well, it's very easy. We'll just take it. We'll take it from the rich senatorial Romans. So these are men in the Senate, own lots of land. So this is the typical kind of process that Commodus and his crew would go through, is they would create fake charges. We'd say, hey, Ritchie, you're actually conspiring against the emperor. Here's some bogus document that we've created. We're going to take all of your land and sell it to the highest bidder, and then you're exiled from Rome and now have to go live somewhere and get out of the way. And this starts slowly, but then it ramps up and up and up until it becomes the norm. And so it gets to a point where senators are now, they don't know if they're going to wake up and there's going to be a knock at the door and the guard is going to be there and being like, we have proof that you were trying to conspire against the state in some way, which they know is false, but what they need money, so they're going to do it. And so again, senators are now freaking out, where they're always looking over their back. The other piece too is the Senate now is quite weak. It used to be this really powerful institution, but again, with men being kicked out of the Senate, Commodus just not caring what they think, and then also Commodus and his friends would sell political office, which includes the Senate, to the highest bidder. So this is another way for them to make money. So merit is out the window. The whole cursus honorum that we talked about last time, where it would take you 20 years to build your way up to become a senator if you weren't already part of that rank, and you would do all these different political positions in service of Rome. That's pretty much out the window. If you have money, you want it, you can have it. There's actually stories of men being assigned to be a governor of a province. They would leave Rome to be governor. By the time they would get there, they'd found out that Commodus or one of his buddies had sold the governorship of that very province to somebody else within the time that this person was traveling to that place. So they would get there and be like, actually, you got to go back because we sold it to somebody else and you're actually not governor. Yeah, exactly. So I really just kind of way to wrap up is Commodus was corrupt. He was short-sighted for sure. And I think the most important thing is he was aggressively passive. He just didn't care. He just kept saying, you guys figure it out. As long as I can go do my games, I don't have to deal with any of this stuff.
Good.
I don't have to. Yeah, I'm just going to, like, he's living like a summer camp almost, right? And he can do whatever he wants.
That's interesting you say that. So it seems like there's, and we were talking about this offline, that it's easy to paint Commodus as this kind of caricature of this madman, crazy emperor who was extravagant in personality and very eccentric, which, is true to some degree, like 100%. But then there's also the reality of kind of what's going on at Rome, outside of anything that Commodus is responsible for or is able to actually handle, right? So you had kind of mentioned the economic climate and decline. So you have the devaluation of the dollar, of the Roman dollar. At this point, the gold coins are being kind of withered down and being mixed with other cheaper alloys. And then I'd also read that there's, at this time, in terms of the labor market within Rome, that there's kind of come to a point where they're overtly reliant on slave labor. And it's probably stretching their treasury and budgetary expenses thin, because, a lot of the public works, I imagine, any construction projects, things of that nature, are probably relied on slave labor at this point.
For sure. And I think that's kind of, for as long as Rome has existed, slaves have been a very key piece of that economy. But I think I know we did talk about Lincoln a little bit while back in the transatlantic slave trade. It is a bit different in Rome. It is not an ethnic slavery. I just think, just to draw that distinction, it's more of a conquered peoples sort of situation. So the Romans would go into Gaul, which was modern day France, take a bunch of slaves back. But then there's a lot of stories of, ex-slaves gaining their freedom and then being able to live as a citizen of Rome. So it's a little bit different in that sense, but you're right. Like, relying on all of this slave labor means you got to keep bringing in more slaves. And then as you're devaluing your currency, like, you have, people you're actually paying wages for, that's going to start to go up, and everything's going to grow and grow and grow. Like, and there's a slave market as well too. And how is that changing? And there's a whole probably economic analysis here on, how the inflation of these coins and, the pieces of how do you rebuild too after this plague has just ravaged your whole empire, right? And there's so few people. So yeah, it's an interesting time for the empire, and, having someone who's going to devalue your currency this way and just spend it on games when you really need to rebuild this economy up because there's just the manpower is so small and the army needs to be rebuilt and all of these things. Yeah, not a great place to be, I would say.
No, and I think that's, maybe we just double down on that for a second to make it like crystal clear. Because I think, it's important to kind of level set on what's actually going on at the ground level. So we have this economic decline that's going on that's not really within the controls. I said maybe like direct control of what Commodus can or cannot do. I'm sure there is some influence there, being the emperor. You have this kind of political instability with corruption, positions being for sale, right? It kind of this hodgepodge of motivations and, interplay of kind of positioning different, governors and consuls against each other. You have military pressure that's still kind of existing and carries forward. We had mentioned it in the Marcus Aurelius episode that, there's always this kind of threat of siege by the Germanic tribes that continue to be a thorn in the empire. We had mentioned the plague as well, right? The Antonine plague is probably still kind of, I don't know if it's going on still or they're kind of dealing with the aftermath of it. But definitely kind of another factor that's kind of, real at the ground level, but again, outside of Commodus's control.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the plague's probably still around in some capacity, absolutely feeling the effects of it. But then it is kind of a peaceful time for Rome. Like the Marcomanni and the Quadi that we talked about last time, those Germanic tribes, they've been beaten. They've signed their peace treaties, and they're also been crushed too by this plague, right? So they're taking time to regroup. Parthians have just been defeated in the east. It's not really a lot of threats. Everybody's just kind of licking their wounds and getting ready to invade once again at some point. And so I think the empire is also very lucky at this point, because if, we talked about it last week, if the roles were flipped and Commodus was first and then Marcus Aurelius was second, who knows what would have happened, because they needed a lot of intervention during the time of Marcus Aurelius to block these things off. So yeah, things aren't good in the empire right now with just, I think like the institutions are so, again, corrupt, number one, but two, just like do not have the prestige that they had before. Like the Senate was, even during the time of these emperors, didn't have as much power during the Republic, but still very, very important. Trajan, one of the things he would do is every time he came to Rome, his number one thing would be like, I need to, I will sit in on Senate sessions. I'm not just going to send a subordinate. Like every time I'm here, I need to show the Senate that I care. And the Senate really appreciated that, where some emperors just didn't care. They would send subordinates. And so it was just like that triangle of people, Senate, and army. Got to keep them all happy in some capacity, which leads into, Commodus kept the people happy with their games, kept the army happy with giving them money and not making them go fight any wars. But he really didn't keep the Senate happy. So that leads into the conspiracies against Commodus. So they started quite soon. So again, with the property confiscation, the senators started to worry about getting a knife in the back or being exiled from Rome. And as Commodus's reign continued, they definitely had to, be increasingly worried. So we're going to enter here Lucilla, who's Commodus's older sister and the widow of Lucius Verus. So just a reminder, Lucius Verus was Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor for, I think, about 8 or 9 years. He died well before Commodus took over. I think it was almost 10 years before. So, but she's still around. She still has the title of Augusta, which means wife of the emperor. So she still has a lot of power from that title. However, again, we go back to what we talked about last time, and the Romans love a nice, evil stepmother sort of woman pulling the strings behind the scenes. She was, they believe, was jealous that Commodus's wife actually had now all the power because she was the true Augusta, we could call it. So they believe that she engineered the conspiracy against her brother. And we don't know for sure if whether it was people came to her or she orchestrated, but was definitely involved in some capacity. So what happened was two senior Roman officials conspired with her to assassinate Commodus, but they botched the attempt. There's a little like Shakespearean piece to this where one man jumped out of was basically waiting for Commodus. He jumped out of the shadows and yelled, "See, this is what the Senate sends you." And then tried to, I think, attack him with some sort of weapon. But within that time where he yelled that, that line that would make it great for a nice play in theater, it gave the guards, a half second to realize what was going on and actually block the attack, right? The first thing if you're doing a conspiracy or you're trying to assassinate someone, the first thing people should hear is person yelling or hearing a stab of a knife or something.
That's so making a grand statement for dramatic flair.
Exactly. Like, again, Shakespeare would have loved it and it would have made a great play. But I think, it doesn't really accomplish your goal. So he was stopped, was tortured, and he gave up his co-conspirators who were all executed. Lucilla was given up as well. She wasn't killed because that wouldn't really look good if the emperor is going to kill his sister, but his aunt at this time. So basically what happens is he exiles her to the island of Capri and then kills her once kind of everybody forgot about her. So again, she's going to get killed, but didn't do it right away.
Not that moment.
Yeah. But what happens is there was two parts to this conspiracy. They knew if they were going to kill Commodus, they had to kill Sertorius as well. So he turns up dead a few days later. And then apparently this is what threw Commodus into a rage when some info was given to him about one of the conspirators. At least 5 men were killed after this, including the 2 consuls for the year. So again, when we talked about this before, was the consuls before there was an emperor were the 2 men every year who would lead the entire republic. And they they continued throughout the time when the emperor existed. Didn't have the power, obviously, that they did before because the emperor had that ultimate power, but were still very influential in the government. So again, both consuls were killed. He even fired 2 future emperors, one called Pertinax and one called Septimius Severus, from their governorship since they failed to capture a conspirator. So I kind of written down here, I call it like, it's like almost some Mad King vibes here, right? It's this.
Yeah, legit. Yep.
Freaking out about this, and rightfully so, right? Like your right-hand man has been killed, who was also one of your many lovers, who, again, there's probably an emotional element to that.
For sure.
Killing men involved who he thinks are involved, we don't know. But then also firing 2 of your established governors because they failed to catch a conspirator. Like, again, most emperors are going to realize, like, okay, you can reprimand them. Maybe you can not give them, when they want to renew their governorship, you maybe don't want to do that. But to just fire them all together because they failed to capture a conspirator, I think, again, that's going to lead to instability. And it's just, again, a bit over the top, I think, for Commodus.
Yeah, that's the Mad King kind of theme is definitely prevalent during this discussion, I would say. You definitely get that from just doing a quick Google on some of the antics that he's kind of famous for. But I find it's interesting to me, that this kind of backdrop of what's going on in Rome. And I wonder if he ever thought, this kind of initial success that he was having from his approach for like games and paying the military off. You've had this kind of balance that's been struck between the people, the military, and the Senate, right? The kind of governing body that, allows you to, govern more effectively. You obviously need buy-in from everybody. It's curious to me that he kind of just forgot about them, in a way where he was so focused on the gamesmanship and the people that governing wasn't necessarily a very high priority. It was more of a means to an end that I think, based on what we're talking about and, what at least historians have kind of communicated is that he used it, but it wasn't necessarily used in the most effective way. It was more to kind of, he it's almost like he created instability, but he then used the instability for his own political and personal gain, which obviously is a recipe for short-term success, but inevitably long-term disaster. Yeah,
I almost think you might even be giving him too much credit. I just don't think he cared. Like, it's from what I've been reading.
Really? Okay.
Like, it's just like, I want to fight I want to fight as a gladiator. I want to have these wild parties back at the palace. I just don't. I just want to live this lifestyle that doesn't really involve leading as an emperor. And I think like he liked the power and the prestige and the money.
Sure.
But like when it came to governorship,
not a high priority.
Yeah. Whatever I think things came to him, it seemed like if he could just push it on to somebody else and not have to deal with it, that was the best thing. Which kind of leads to some other things that he did where he fired most of his father's old advisors and military leaders and replaced them with his own people. So I think we can kind of see that, like, I bet you if you're a seasoned official or advisor of Marcus Aurelius, you understand how good government works. You're going to try to advise Commodus to do the right thing and tell him what he needs to do. Commodus doesn't want to hear that, though. So he's going to fire you and probably put in one of his own guys who's going to say, oh, yeah, no problem. We'll handle it. Oh, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, we'll go handle this. And so this kind of leads to, in Rome, those murders and confiscations of property for anybody who disagrees with Commodus became a theme. And so we'll get into that in a little bit more. But I think like one piece maybe we should talk about here is this assassination attempt. We think we can start to see as a bit of a turning point. And it's a common theme I think we see in history where I've got written down here like assassination attempt leads to paranoia, which leads to bloodshed, which leads to paranoia for everybody involved. And then it's just kind of like an infinite loop and it gets worse and worse. And like we see it with Hitler, right? He got slightly more crazy every time someone tried to kill him.
100%. Yeah.
And so I think we see that with Commodus here is this assassination attempt definitely said, well, everybody's out to get me. So I'm going to put my own people in charge and they're not going to push back and make me happy. And I can continue to live the life I want to live.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Like I know we haven't gotten to his personal excess yet, but it's, I wonder how much that is at play with the increase in paranoia, because based on what I read, it seems like, again, he had this kind of early success. He was able to kind of be this emperor of the people. And then, the trigger point being this attempted assassination. He becomes increasingly paranoid and eccentric and kind of sporadic in his actions and thoughtfulness. And that seems to, I think, maybe manifest or even kind of take on new heights with some of his personal, experiences and events that he's kind of been holding for himself.
Definitely. I think, it's this, like we talked about, ultimate power being so young. Now this assassination attempt, I think there was just all these catalysts that just kind of led to an extra dial on the dial. We're going from, maybe he's a 4 on the crazy scale to 5 to 6 to 7. And we'll get to when he gets to 11 pretty soon. So I think this is a good time as we kind of roll through some of the, maybe before we get into the crazy stories, we'll get into a little bit of more about his governance. And again, just letting anybody, putting in his own people, but you also start to see why he was such a weak leader was he let smart people take advantage of him. They knew that he didn't care, or he didn't have the foresight to understand when people are starting to use him, or the political savviness. So one thing here is he has a new favorite administrator, and this person's name was Cleander. So the first kind of story we hear about Cleander was there was a detachment of soldiers from Britain who decided to march to Rome to air their grievances about a harsh general that they had. Most think that this general is actually doing a good job, harsh disciplinarian, making sure that they were always ready to fight. But the soldiers didn't like that, so they marched all the way to Rome. Commodus gets words of this, and Cleander basically tells them that they're actually marching. Well, part of what they're doing is there's a conspiracy against you from this general to take over and become emperor. Coincidentally enough, Cleander had some issues with this general, so he kind of uses this as a way to convince Commodus to allow him to execute the general plus his whole wife and family. Kind of like we see in Gladiator, sort of that sort of situation, right? So again, Gladiator being fiction, there's a lot of truth into those stories. But then also what comes from this is there was a purge of senators, so murders, confiscations, all that stuff. And coincidentally, they were all, or for the most part, enemies of Cleander. So again, this kind of shows that Cleander came in, understood he could use Commodus to his advantage, get ridiculously rich, and use him to basically, whatever his, political will is, kind of use Commodus to achieve those goals. So he continues to Cleander and Commodus, but mostly, again, at this point, I think it's almost fair to say that like Commodus is just I don't say he's just a figurehead, but he's just kind of doing his own thing, and Cleander's really running the day-to-day. He continued to sell positions and administrations, and the administration of the empire fell into disarray. The military, for the first time in a while, is actually not the force that it used to be. So under like Hadrian and Marcus and Antoninus Pius, it was like they were always being, going through drills and making sure that they were in fighting shape. In this case, that starts to go away. There's desertion in the military, general unrest in the provinces because, again, leaders are being changed every 5 seconds. And this is when it kind of all comes together. So there's a climax came in the year 190, which had had exactly 25 consuls in 1 year. So usually it's just 2. 25 consuls, all appointed by Cleander, which is a record in the 1,000-year history of the Roman consulship. And basically, the consul used to be this distinguished position after 20 to 30 years of excellent service to the empire or to the republic. It was not even a shell of that now. It was basically just a piece of paper that you could buy. And so, again, if you paid more, you got the consulship. And that's what essentially has now become of, Rome and everything like that. And so the question is, where's Commodus during all of this? And well, maybe I think this is a good segue into he was, training to be a gladiator. So I think this is when some of the stuff starts to get a little, you start to scratch your head and go, this guy was an emperor. So kind of to set the stage in Rome. So musicians, artists, and most of all gladiators are the lowest rung of society. So they're the poor of the poor. Typically gladiators are mostly slaves. So for example, a noble person, a senator, fighting in the gladiatorial ring or being an artist, that was like unheard of, never would happen. An emperor fighting as a gladiator, it's not even that it was unheard of, it was almost like unspeakable. Like it was something that would just break people's brains, right?
Sure, yeah.
So
it's like probably I would say it's like like contemporary example, like a leader of a government being on the front lines. You know what I mean? It just doesn't just doesn't compute.
Yeah, exactly. Like Joe Biden leading the charge into like a battle or something like that.
Sure,
like,
exactly.
It's just like, it's not something that you can even think of. But Commodus actually, though, maybe not the Joe Biden examples, not the best example just based on his age, but Commodus was actually a decent fighter, well-built, strong. So he trained and took to his gladiatorial training quite seriously and became quite a good fighter.
Makes sense, given his panache for physical activity as a youth,
Exactly, yeah. Definitely living in a military camp and stuff. Definitely had the opportunity to learn some of those things. But of course, he never fought a fair fight. You can't have your emperor dying in the ring to.
Well, that was going to be my question to you, actually, because I had read about that, but I didn't see anything. But I, just assumed that those gladiatorial games in which he took part weren't likely completely fair across the board.
There would be situations where he was given, a sword that's of the finest steel in the empire to some crappy kind of broken up weapon or something that, would shatter when
like one hit away from just breaking. Yeah.
Exactly. So he was never going to be killed. Like you can't have that risk. So they always rigged all the fights for him. The best is that attendance was mandatory for all senators. So easiest way to get on his hit list, don't show up to the games where he's fighting. So in the arena, Commodus opponents always submitted to the emperor. So, as a result, he never lost. Cassius Dio claims that this is where it really starts to get crazy. Cassius Dio claimed that citizens of Rome who were missing their feet through illness or accident were taken into the arena, tethered together for Commodus to club to death while pretending they were giants. Dio also wrote that it was, I know, maybe we'll stop there. So I guess the idea is like he stacked them on top of each other and then he's like, oh, I'm like a David versus Goliath situation. And so I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah. So Dio also wrote that it was Commodus's custom to privately use deadly weapons to fight, murdering and maiming his opponents. For each appearance in the arena, he charged the city of Rome 1 million, I guess it's sesterces. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's this silver coin. So basically, every time he was there, charged the city 1 million of these silver coins, which again strains the economy. Commodus was also known for fighting exotic animals in the arena, often to the horror and disgust of the Roman populace. According to Cassius Dio, Commodus once killed 100 lions in a single day. Later, he decapitated a running ostrich with a specifically designed dart, and afterward he carried his sword and the bleeding head of the dead bird over to the senator's seating area and mentioned as though they were next. Dio notes that the targeted senators actually found this more ridiculous than frightening and kind of laughed it off. And then there was occasions where Commodus killed 3 elephants on the floor of the arena by himself, and then he also killed a giraffe in one.
Yeah, I read about that also, and I saw bear was thrown into the mix, and that he was also known to participate in hunts, and he would stage fights between animals for his own entertainment.
Exactly, totally normal behavior, right? Especially for an emperor. Yeah. So
yes, checks out.
So this is the kind of person we're dealing with, is this self-absorbed, like, I want to create these grand spectacles. And, a lot of when we see like ancient Roman, great warriors, it's like, I want to achieve, like, look at Julius Caesar, for example. He may have had this, I would say cockiness of and kind of self-centeredness of someone like Commodus, but his thing was, I'm going to invade an entire country and take over all this land and bring military glory to Rome, versus I'm going to stage fights in an arena and just have everybody, gushing over me all the time and getting that instant gratification. So it's the same sort of thing. But again, Julius Caesar understood this is going to take me decades to figure out. And it's going to be a slow process and I'm going to get what I want, versus Commodus, give me that instant feedback. I need to cut off the heads of various things and see the crowd cheer for me and things like that.
It's interesting. You kind of that point of self-absorption, right? And ego. And when we kind of contrast that to his father, Marcus Aurelius, it's interesting because, I don't think we even used the word self-absorbed or egotistical once when in that podcast, and we talked for an hour on Marcus Aurelius and his successes. And I think just to kind of double down on the self-absorption. So I had a couple of points that came up as well. This one, I think, these two would probably, really just hammer it home for people. So when we're talking about like personal servants and staff, so Commodus apparently had a large group of personal servants and staff who catered to his every whim and every need. And he would often dress in elaborate costumes amongst them and demand to be treated like a god. Statues and artwork. So he would commission numerous statues and works of art in his own likeness, which he would display throughout the empire. He had a particular interest in Egyptian art, and he often commissioned works that depicted himself as an Egyptian pharaoh.
Just doesn't end with this guy, right? Like, even the statues too, he would dress himself up like Hercules, because he didn't think he was like Hercules. He thought he actually was Hercules, who would come back. And like, there always is a level of this with any emperor. You almost have to, almost, and you can see, almost deify yourself, and like, you are above everybody else, because that's part of what you do to command power. Like, it's not out of the ordinary for an emperor to build statues, put them on coins and stuff like that. But there's usually always a means to the end. This just seemed like
it's instant. It's so interesting too, though, right? Like, compared to, again, like, well, I guess I have a couple points on the comparison between, or the contrast between him and his father. But with Marcus Aurelius, you have this kind of philosopher king, this like this sage, that is kind of there, and you have this, the myth surrounding him, and it's kind of like he's deified in a certain way, but in the total opposite spectrum versus Commodus, who is kind of who's taking like legitimate steps to deify himself, without the kind of positive connotations that we associate with Marcus Aurelius.
I even think in Meditations too, Marcus talks about like, don't worry about leaving a legacy. That's not something that's important yet. It's kind of funny that he has one of the best legacies that was was left, and so I guess that message doesn't really seem to go to Commodus, which again, another great segue into my subheading here that I have called Commodus's crazy stories. So I got about 6 or 7 here that I'm going to read through, and then Richie, we can get your reaction to some of these. So first one is, again, we talked about him believing he was the incarnation of Hercules, so he would frequently emulate the legendary hero's feats by appearing in the arena to fight wild animals, commissioning statues of him dressed as Hercules. There's a rumor that he threw an operator of a bathhouse into an oven when the water wasn't warm enough, or he had him thrown in, didn't do it himself. he changed his name to, so this is a long one, to Lucius Aulus Aurelius Commodus Augustus Herculeus Romanus Exupertorius Amazonius Invictus Felix Pius. He changed the names of the months of the year to match his now exactly 12 names.
I read that. Yeah, that's...
He declared himself the new Romulus. So Romulus and Remus are the founders, or kind of the story is that they were the founders of Rome. So he claimed he was the new Romulus, and ritually refound Rome, renaming the city Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, which again named after him. The legions were renamed Commodity. The fleet that imported grain from Africa was termed Alexandra Commedia Togata. The Senate was, again, the Senate was named after him. The palace was named after him. The people were named after him. And then all these reforms were named after him. So basically he just renamed everything after him. And this is kind of, near the end. He would bring people in to the palace with missing limbs, and the quote was, "Watch them hobble around, toy with them, and then eventually kill them." He used to play Operation on people, so I think we can leave the details out on that one. And then he killed his wife for having an affair, which again is the ultimate, does he not get the irony? This guy is probably doing that on a daily basis.
Yeah. So
again, it just kind of gets worse and worse and worse. Essentially, naming the 12 months after yourself, naming this, the one that you don't touch is the city of Rome itself, and you rename it after you. So
I'm actually blown away, to be honest with you, at that level of narcissism. It is actually quite incredible. He probably would have been an influencer in the modern era.
I think so.
To be honest with you, a really successful one, probably. It's actually quite. I'd read some stories, but I didn't read those stories, and I'm actually quite blown away. And if anything, I think that just really emboldens the contrast for me between just one generation of rulers and kind of elite families within, if we're comparing him to his father, that is just that is absolutely remarkable. And I don't know how you explain it in any way, shape, or form. I'm at a loss to try to understand how, to that. I think I made the point in the last episode, that analogy people use. And I think I said, in some cases, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And in this case, I believe the apple fell and it was thrown. And now, I don't think thrown is even remotely close enough to kind of, to capture how divergent these two people were.
It's almost like, put the apple in a cannon and launch it across, I think we'll get into the nature versus nurture discussion, but
sure. Yeah.
Maybe, I'm lost for words too. Cause other than just saying this guy was nuts, maybe that's all it really was, but let's maybe just wrap up his story.
Sure.
And then we can get into a little bit of, maybe we try not to speculate on here, but I think you have to speculate a little bit.
You have to.
This is just, there's too much going on here.
He's asking for it.
Exactly. What did he think was going to happen here, right? So again, after this kind of renaming Rome after himself and renaming everything, people are starting to realize, oh boy, this guy's a little bit different than I think what we realized. Everyone kind of knew he was something different, and maybe they were able to manage it, but this is getting a little bit ridiculous. So a couple of things happened. So a food shortage took place in Rome, and it was blamed on Cleander. So what happened was the people who were kind of against Cleander sent a bunch of children out with anti-Cleander banners. And the one thing about the Romans in this crazy time period was everybody was in agreement that clubbing children to death is probably not a good idea. So the children are fine. They have some good news here, right? So they went out with their anti-Cleander banners, but then this started a riot, and basically everyone was shouting out against Cleander. So Cleander sent out the guard to put it down. But then there was also the urban police that were run by a man named Pertinax. He sent them in, and Cleander thought, oh great, they're here, they're going to help put the mob down. But he told them to go in and protect the mob from the guard. And so the guard was like, well, we're overmatched now. So Cleander runs to Commodus for help. Naturally, Commodus gives him up, because what does he care, right? Everybody's expendable in his world. Cleander's given to the mob. and then they kill him and drag him through the streets. And then naturally another round of purges is gone. So anybody close to Cleander, Commodus kills, confiscates property, kind of the same song and dance for that time. And then later on, Commodus's new mistress at the time found out a list of people he planned to kill for the year. And again, we don't know. Again, he has a list, right? Here's my list, right?
For a year. Yeah, for a year.
I know. It's funny because I read that and I was like, oh yeah, he had a list. And then you start laughing and I'm like, right, that's an absolutely insane thing to do. So he has his list. The mistress, I don't know if somebody was on there that she was close to or whatever. And so she tries to poison him. He gets wise to it, spits out his food. But then a bunch of people in the Senate realize, okay, we got to get rid of this guy. They have another man named Pertinax who they're like, we're going to get you to take over the throne. He was a little bit hesitant, but he realizes like someone's got to do it. So they send in his wrestling partner. He's in the bath at the time. He goes in and actually strangles Commodus to death while he's in the bath. So Commodus is dead, but like we kind of talked about, the next year is called the Year of the Five Emperors. So Pertinax takes over, is killed by the Praetorian Guard. Then the Praetorian Guard sells off the actual emperorship to the highest bidder. So this whole precedent of selling off office actually is now going to someone, like it's going to the highest office in the land. Someone ends up buying it, and then people are like, no respect for this guy. He gets killed. A bunch of people take over, and eventually Septimius Severus, who was the governor of Africa, who we mentioned earlier, was fired from his position. He takes over. But the big thing here that's different is he's seen how terrible this system is that Commodus was running, this buying and selling, and how the government has essentially, and the way he looks at it is the government's a failure right now. And so he comes in and essentially has this, I would call it like a centralized, almost like a despotism, where it's like, I run everything comes through me. And he only cared about the army. He was like, just keep the army happy because they'll keep me in charge. And he was, again, outside of really adding some stability to the empire, he was a pretty bad leader, I would say. And so that kind of led into his kids taking over, and his one son Caracalla was maybe just as crazy as Commodus. And this turnover of emperors over and over again throughout this 3rd century, because these institutions were essentially broke down. And Commodus, again, was he totally responsible for this, or did he accelerate the process that was going to happen inevitably? Sure. Maybe a bit of both, but that's kind of what led to this, what we call the crisis of the 3rd century, until Diocletian takes over and brings some stability back to the empire. But again, it's going from this Roman peace to a full-on crisis century, with Commodus kind of jam-packed right in the middle. It's kind of where he gets the unfortunate kind of title of, the end of the great Roman times and the beginning of the end. So yeah, that's him. That's Commodus for you.
What a way to go out, honestly. Yeah. And it just, again, I think, before we get into the last part of our discussion, I think just that narrative, the story surrounding him, it couldn't be more different than the episode we did on Marcus Aurelius, right? And I kept going back to this just because like my mind couldn't let it go. This the divergence between father and son. So I just did like a quick list of key differences between Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, just to kind of put it out, get it onto paper essentially, because I just had such a hard time kind of reconciling those two realities. So the first bucket was kind of like personality. So what's Marcus Aurelius known for? He's wise, he has humility, he's philosophical in nature, he's a philosopher king. He's well-educated, reflective. He wrote about his thoughts and ideas and meditations. Then you have Commodus. He's known for his arrogance, impulsiveness, lack of self-control. He's more interested in indulging his own pleasures and self-serving than in governing the empire effectively. You have military experience, right? And this was kind of a point of contention when we started the analysis on Marcus Aurelius, which was he had a very great formal education, but he didn't necessarily have the military tactician skills or expertise that his predecessors had, but he was able to adapt and learn and, actually have some success legitimately against, several external threats to the Roman Empire. Like we had mentioned, the Parthians and the Germanic tribes. He was praised for his leadership. Commodus had no military experience and wasn't really interested in it. He was much more interested in staging extravagant gladiatorial games rather than defending the empire. And And then kind of, the two last ones, leadership style. It couldn't be more different. Marcus Aurelius, what's he known for? Being fair and just as a leader. He's well respected by his subjects and his fellow elites for how wise and even-handedness he is. He's open to advice from his advisors. He took their opinions into account when making decisions. That is a great leader. Those are things you want in someone who's going to be a leader. And then contrast it to Commodus, who's known for tyrannical and capricious leadership. Again, he's more interested in consolidating his own power than in governing, and he often ignored the advice of any of his advisors. More or less, it seems like his advisors just told him exactly what he wanted to hear, whether it was the truth or not.
Yeah.
And then ultimately legacy. And we're talking about father and son here, who couldn't have two more, disparagingly different legacies. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as one of the greatest emperors in Roman history. He's the philosopher king. His books are still studied today. You know what I mean? I have Meditations right next to me right now. He's remembered for his military victories and his efforts to maintain stability. And Commodus, what's he remembered for? More or less, as a failed emperor who is, often associated with the, beginning of the end for the Roman Empire through his incompetence, extravagance, and just general cruelty.
Yeah, this is like a virtue piece too to that, right? Like, I can't remember what it was. I saw somebody talk. It was like some Redditor talked about like a situation where like how each of the emperors would treat something like that was going on, and it was like Commodus and Caligula would be incredibly cruel in the situation. Julius Caesar would make it sound like it was 10 times more crazy than it was, and then Marcus Aurelius would nurse. I think it was like a beached whale or something like that turned up in Rome, and they were talking about it. And it's like Marcus Aurelius would have been out there like throwing water on the whale personally and making sure it nursed it back to health, and then would go visit it every year to make sure it was doing well, versus Commodus would rip it open and cut its head off and say, "I'm Hercules who have slain this great whale," or something. Like, two completely different people. And then, like, again, from the virtue side of things, but also, like, I think you touched on the leadership style. And I think the piece that kind of stuck out to me was when we see it today with leaders, right? The best leaders are never the smartest. They're the people who know who to listen to, know who to bring into the room and create a consensus and create a conversation. So, for example, with Marcus, doesn't know about military. He's going to bring in the best and the brightest. Yep. And he's going to ask them what to do, and he's going to learn from them, and he's going to know when to call them out when they're talking nonsense, and he knows when to really sit down and listen to exactly what they say. Where Commodus doesn't want to hear any of that. He just wants people to say, yes, we'll do whatever you want, or don't worry about it, we'll handle it. We don't need your, advice on this. So I think those are kind of two pieces that stuck out to me. And then I think the third piece, and it's something I got written down here, is just on his age, right? And so I did a quick look at the emperors up to this point. So when we talk about crazy emperors, you have Commodus, you have Nero, and you have Caligula. They're the three that kind of come up. Nero became emperor at 16, Caligula at 25, and Commodus at 19. When we look at most of the other emperors, about 40 is kind of the average age. I think Marcus Aurelius was, I want to say late 30s, early 40s. Augustus was 36. You got a bunch of guys taking over in their 50s. So these are much more experienced men who have gone through the trials and tribulations. They know they have to earn their way in to become emperor. They weren't just given it at a young age, or as this is your birthright, you're going to get it. So I think that's another piece too. And, we talk about last episode how Machiavelli had this whole argument about how the great Roman emperors were adopted, and that's why they were so good. But I think the piece he really misses, they were all just too young. I think that's another piece too. Like, just giving somebody, again, if you give any, and I think we're all guilty of this, right? When we're young, we think we know everything, but if you give them ultimate power, maybe that's just a natural decline, right? And regardless of who Commodus was as a person, I think age is a huge, huge piece to this that I don't think it's talked about enough when we talk about like why he was so crazy.
Yeah, I think that's actually such a great point. What happens when you give a 16-year-old imperial powers?
Yeah, imperial, like,
you know what
power.
I mean? Like, imperial power, right? You give a 16-year-old imperial power, and it kind of makes sense when you frame it that way, right? Like, when you think about the mindset of, well, obviously it's conjecture here, but we're talking about 16-year-olds as we know them. And they're not always the most rational. I can speak from experience. When I was 16, I was most definitely not the most rational, pragmatic. I think, you are very self-serving at that particular era of your life because you are very self-involved and self-absorbed. And it's always interesting to me, when we talk about history and we talk about gaps of hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we're still just people at the end of the day, and how many of those similarities kind of still exist. And I would imagine something similar would probably happen if, you gave a 16, it'd probably be worse now, but if you gave a 16-year-old in 2023 imperial powers.
Yeah. I guess that unchecked, everybody's going to have to agree with you, right? Because you are the emperor, you have ultimate power. And if ultimately your life could be ended if you don't do what the emperor says. So it's just like, again, I think there's the age thing is definitely a big piece. There's definitely something lurking within Commodus, in terms of like some narcissistic personality disorder in, I think, some capacity, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's an interesting conversation about like the nature versus nurture piece of this. I think the nurture side of like everything that Marcus Aurelius gave him, I think definitely would have put him on the correct path. There was definitely some element of nature to who he was as a person. And I think it's just like the experiences that he had in his life. Like he was never really given a major crisis in Rome, for example, where he had to go, oh my God, I have to take responsibility for my actions now. He's essentially a man-child, for lack of a better term, like just kind of like this young boy who's just been living this lavish life of doing whatever they want without consequences. And he just never really grew up, I think is part of it as well. So yeah, I don't really know. You can go to a bunch of different directions. I'm sure we can speculate, but I think just kind of putting him in the environment that he did at such a young age with whatever was kind of lurking deep within him. And it could have gone the other way, right? Like say there was a big crisis right as Marcus died and they needed Commodus to defend the empire. Maybe it kicks something in him where he's maybe not quite his father, but he's maybe somewhere in between of what he ended up being.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, right? We're looking at this kind of decision, quote unquote. But to me, it's ultimately looking at, what makes a good leader, right? And we're looking at father and son, which is such a unique historical example, right? Given the context. And I think like one of my key takeaways from this particular discussion, and it's not something that was kind of obvious to me before we started talking, is that there is absolutely no substitute for experience. And I think to your point about age, and if we look at the more infamous emperors, they tend to be younger in age, whereas the ones that we hold to a higher esteem or we don't hold to any level of infamy, are typically a bit older. And I think there is a real point of analysis there that I think holds a lot of water.
Yeah, definitely. It's just like it is just like there's just so many factors coming in, and I think your experience point is bang on too. Of we look at someone like Marcus, right, just joining Antonius Pius on all of these journeys, sitting in on all these meetings for 10 plus years longer than Commodus would have ever had the chance to.
Exactly.
Plus he's Marcus Aurelius, so he's gonna take things in, right? So yeah, it's a tough one to see kind of where all this comes from and where did it go, but I think it's just a mix of that experience and, the environment, right? Like thrown into the environment where you're given everything you want. No one's going to question you.
Exactly.
It's almost an inevitable outcome for someone who's kind of predisposed to this type of personality. And, again, being unchecked, I think is another thing too, right? Just like,
I was just about to say that. I think the unchecked ego and narcissism is probably a big one. I think everyone's a little narcissistic at times, right? Like there is a healthy level of narcissism that everyone should probably have, but it needs to be checked. There needs to be balances. And I think let's kind of take that to another kind of point of analysis. And a takeaway for me would be, I think these two episodes back to back, the Marcus Aurelius episode and this episode on Commodus, is really illuminating because, whether you are working on your own leadership skills or you're looking at people who want to fill leadership skills, I think you have two very good archetypes to kind of use as, guideposts. One in the direction of what you do want in a leader, and another guidepost in terms of what exactly you don't want in a leader. And I think these two episodes back to back have done a really good job for me, kind of crystallizing that to a higher degree.
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of, it really is black and white at the end of the day when we look at it like this. And you've mentioned it a few times, like just how polar opposite these two are. And, one being so like open to experience, so open to what people are telling him, listening, learning, reflecting, trying to improve and be better, from a personal perspective as a father and as an emperor, to someone who is, whatever the shortest, most, I guess, exciting and stimulating event that he could find, he was going to do. Again, it is, but I think like it's part of there's some themes I think from Commodus, right? Like he's crazy and everything, but like again, listening and understanding and finding that healthy level of narcissism, because I think too, right? If Marcus definitely had his level of narcissism where he knew what he wanted and kind of helped him command some respect, but exactly. what that balancing point is I think the key with the two here.
Yep. Totally agree.
Awesome. Well, I think that's maybe a good point to kind of wrap up, unless you got any maybe closing thoughts.
No, I think we kind of wrapped it up well. I think leadership is a funny thing, and you have to be quite fickle with some of the characteristics and archetypes that we look at. And I think this particular kind of, I guess these two back-to-back case studies provide a very unique historical example of how divergent leaders can be, even when of the same bloodline and lineage. And I think that's probably the coolest part about these two episodes back to back for me, that has kind of illuminated and probably even made me appreciate Marcus Aurelius more than I already did prior to learning more about him.
Nice. Couldn't have said it better. And couldn't have said it better myself. I think that's a really good way to wrap it up. So I guess I'll thank everybody for tuning into this episode. I hope you enjoyed this one and the last one. Kind of, we changed things up a little bit, but I think they came together quite well. So hope you enjoyed, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the History in Motion podcast. We appreciate your support, and if you're a fan of what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you next time.